Hi. Right now, I want to give you some highlights from the fall of the Roman Empire, the demise of the Roman Empire, up to the time of Charlemagne, and past Charlemagne into the High Middle Ages. So we're going to be tracing things from the late antiquity period, the end of the ancient world, right on through the medieval world of Europe, with the idea of sticking to broad themes. I'm going to leave to your textbook reading the more specific details on some of these things. I'm sticking to broad themes. First thing I wanted to say, and by the way, there is a PowerPoint that accompanies this lecture, so please look at that on the Blackboard site. Late antiquity, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those terms that started being used a few decades ago that it covers the history from around the year 300 to around 700. There's no clear date. No one woke up on January 1st in the year 350 and says this marks the beginning of late antiquity. It's the time period when the Roman Empire is in its last stages, hasn't fallen entirely. We'll take a look at the concept of the fall of the empire, and medieval Europe has not yet been formulated. So around 300 to around 700. I mention this not because I want you to memorize different terms, but it sometimes is useful to kind of organize the material that you're reading. When we say Middle Ages, we mean from the year 500 onward, basically. The High Middle Ages, usually, from around the year 1000 to the year 1250, or from the year 1000 to the year 1300. And then the Late Middle Ages, usually from the year 1300 to about 1450, or sometimes the year 1500. That's how historians use these periods as kind of a shorthand. So, question here, did Rome fall? What happened to its demise? And then I want to say something about the three heirs to the Roman Empire. So the traditional story goes this way. Rome was a powerful empire. It fell apart. Then you had the Dark Ages. And then you had the Renaissance. That's sort of incorrect. Historians today don't talk about the Dark Ages. A lot actually happened. The Renaissance did occur, but the idea that Rome fell and then was followed by Dark Ages and then followed by Renaissance tells us more about the Renaissance's view of itself. If you're writing from the perspective of the Renaissance in the 1400s and 1500s, or if you're writing from the perspective of a 19th century historian, you might look at everything that happened in Italy with the Renaissance as being a great revival. That's certainly how Italians in Florence and other places in Italy thought of themselves during the Renaissance. But that's not how people in the Middle Ages thought of themselves. They didn't think of themselves as living in the Dark Ages. And furthermore, there were very interesting developments that were going on during these alleged Dark Ages. If by Dark Age you mean, there was no more Roman Empire, well, that's sort of true. The historians say don't talk about the Dark Ages because there's so much going on in terms of technology and economics and society. This traditional story of Rome falling, then Dark Ages, then Renaissance, I'm kind of calling that whole thing into question. The Renaissance has the first opportunity to kind of craft this interpretation. And then other scholars in the Enlightenment have an opportunity to add to this. And then more historians in the 19th century talk about this as well. So it kind of becomes ingrained in us. But this is not the way history actually unfolded. Edward Gibbon, you probably have not heard of him, but he wrote a very famous multi-volume history called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Volume 1 was published in 1776, which is kind of interesting, known for another big event in that year. And so he kind of gives us the more modern perspective, going into the 19th century of how historians and students will study this period. Rome falls, it topples, and then the Renaissance comes around 1,000 years later. So fall of Rome, I'm going to suggest a few things. Number one, it's more nuanced than that. There's no single barbarian invasion that marks the end of the empire. There are multiple invasions, but there is not one invasion, nor is there one battle or 1 year in which the whole thing goes topsy-turvy, upside down. Most historians today talk about a gradual transformation from the period of the crisis of the Roman Empire, after 280, into an unraveling, if you will, of the Roman Empire. Fourth, it's not just one event, but it's an accumulation of many events over almost a century that leads to the demise of the empire. One day you're aware of their barbarian invasions, but the empire is still there. A century later, there's no empire there to speak of, but it's a gradual transition. Furthermore, in a very powerful way, the Roman ideal persists. The military might not be there, the armies might not be there, but the idea of the Roman political ideal persists. This idea we might call Romanitas, Romanness, persists even after the empire is gone. People who had lived under the rule of the empire, even when the empire is gone, the military protection is gone, they still carry on the traditions of the empire. They are aware of having inherited this idea of Romanitas, Romanness. We can see this continuation of the Roman ideal right up to the time of Charlemagne, when he's crowned emperor by the Pope. He is, in a very self-conscious way, reenacting the greatness that was Rome. Now, it's a different world, obviously, but that's what they thought they were doing. So my point is that the Roman ideal persists. Secondly, the Roman idea not just persists in the West, but the empire itself persists in the East. That did not fall. The Emperor Justinian, emperor of the Eastern Empire, tried in the 500s to try to take back sections of the Western Empire and almost succeeded, but ultimately failed. It's until the early 600s, early in the 7th century, that a Roman state persists in the East. So we don't really see this disappearance in the East. And this is replaced eventually by Byzantium. So we don't see this destruction in the East at the same time we see destruction in the West. Thirdly, Christianity spreads. If Rome has one major contribution to make to the culture of early modern Europe and to medieval Europe, it's that of Christianity, which really shapes the culture. Rome, as empire, became Christianized. So if Christianity continues, to that extent at least, the Roman Empire has not ended. Some people still want a particular date for the Roman Empire to end, and for that I'll give you a date, 476, at least in the West, okay, because there are a series of events, and so 476 for a lot of people marks the stage at which it's pretty obvious things are not going well. But there's lots of regional variation with this persistence of local Romanitas, local Romanness going on. You would have experienced the demise of the empire differently depending upon where you lived. Did you live in the Middle East, in Jerusalem? Did you live in Gaul? Were you up in Britain? The heartlands, the center part of the empire, experienced things differently than the frontiers along the Danube River, along the Rhine River. The imperial center in Rome would have experienced things differently. So experientially, people saw the empires unraveling in much different ways. It's where you were focused. Pax Romana, as I said, ends around 180. There's a crisis that goes on to 280, 284. Lots of civil wars and challenges along the frontiers. There's inflation, there's lack of confidence, and increased militarization of Roman, civilian life. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine improved matters, but not significantly. Ultimately, there isn't just one cause. There are multiple causes to the demise of the empire, and historians argue about this all the time, which is the most important one. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this because this would take a whole several hours of lecture to parse this out. There are a lot of different things that mark the end of Rome. Um, One of the key things, though, is the role of these different groups, barbarians, coming into Rome. Rome is sacked 3 times in the 400s. 410 by the Visigoths, led by Alaric. In 455 by the Vandals. We get our word vandalism from that group. In the sack of Rome in 476 by Odoacer, which is kind of like the ultimate turning point there, because at that point it's obvious that Rome's not going to regain the ability to control what goes on within its city limits. Again, the events of the 5th century, very, very pivotal for that. The 3 heirs to the Roman Empire that I talked about that emerge from the demise of this empire and they all work differently. One is Byzantium. That's the eastern end of the empire, ruled by Justinian at one point and headquartered in Constantinople. It gives rise to the Eastern Orthodox, form of Christianity. That's one heir to the Roman Empire, and it continues. So we can't say the empire ended. The barbarian and Germanic West. That means things that are going on in what's later to become, Austria, Germany, Britain, France, and finally Islam and the Arab world, which will eventually, take control of the southernmost portion of the Mediterranean world, eventually moving into Spain, and also into the Middle East. So if you were to come back a couple hundred years later, you see these 3 heirs. They all build upon what Rome left behind, although they all 3 offer different historical directions at this point. The world in the East, Byzantium, is going to take on a different culture. The world under Islam will take on a different culture, especially in terms of its political rule and its religion. And the barbarian West will take on a different culture with the infusion of ideas from the Germanic tribes. We'll look at Charlemagne coming down the road in a few minutes here. So in some ways, the Roman Empire sowed the seeds of its own destruction in terms of its relationship with the Germanic world. The recent historian here, Peter Heather of Oxford University, came out with this massive book a few years ago in which he argues that the barbarian invasions, in fact, were decisive, for this. So I would have to concur that, with the persistence of the Roman ideal notwithstanding, it is the barbarians in successive waves that really kind of unravel the empire and bring forward the 3 heirs to the empire. And particularly, it will mean the beginnings of Europe, which is still too early to talk about Europe yet. By the time we get to Charlemagne, it's not premature to start talking about the origins of Europe. To give you a couple examples of what I was talking about, how different parts of the empire would have experienced things differently, Rome begins to remove its legions from Britain, up around London, around 370. And it continues until about the year 410. Now, one day you wake up and you say, oh, the Roman armies are, decamping, they're going back to Rome. But they'll come back someday, They don't come back. In fact, the other Roman soldiers a few years later pack up and they go back. Suddenly you wake up at one point in time, you say, you know what? There's no more Roman armies here. They're not coming back. As long as Britain's not being attacked, that's okay. But when Britain is attacked, then it's going to create some difficulties there. So Britain's experience was a little bit different, especially with the invasion of the Saxons. Another experience in Gaul, which is now France and Western Germany, the Rhine River freezes, which it very seldom does, on New Year's Eve in the year 406. And given this opportunity to cross the river, the Vandals and other barbarians crossed the river. Now, these were not just barbarians who were out to kill Romans. these were the barbarians who were subcontractors in some cases to the Roman military. Rome had taught them how to fight, gave them weapons. They traded with the Romans. Um, they aspired to be Roman. They wanted to be more like the Romans. But it was not just an invasion. They were being pushed by people to their east. So in some ways, they were being pressured to go across the Rhine River. They were as much refugees at this moment in time as they were invaders. But this is the experience. One day you're sitting there speaking your language and thinking in Latin, and the next minute you realize there's all these barbarians walking around in your midst, and you realize there aren't any Roman armies to protect you anymore. Okay, so that's another way to conceptualize this. Fast forwarding now a little bit here to the time of Charlemagne. Our next big step forward here in terms of this persistence of the Roman ideal is with the Carolingian dynasty. Carolingian being the adjective of Charles. Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great, was the son of Pippin, and also Charles Martel's grandson. They were very instrumental in turning back the Muslim invaders in France earlier. Charlemagne gives us the first real empire to replace the Roman Empire. And it's not an insignificant empire. It's rather large. It is, however, only European. It combines Germanic elements. These are political customs that come from the Germanic tribes. It also contains Roman ideas of kingship and law. So you see this blending of Germanic principles with Roman ideals as you forge this new empire. We have a wonderful portrait of Charlemagne by the writer Einhard, so we know a good deal about him as in terms of his biography. We also know there was something called the Carolingian Renaissance, headquartered in Aachen in Germany, which is today just a small, a little city. It's very pretty, but it's not a major city in Germany by any means. Aachen became the center of Charlemagne's empire. He didn't spend much time there, but he built a wonderful palace and this beautiful cathedral there. He brings scholars from all around Europe and the former Roman Empire to come there. And they begin transcribing all these things. A lot of these documents from the ancient world get preserved because they were there. They invent certain, editing techniques, like punctuation and because how do you know, and capitalization. It was the scholarly center of the world. I would probably add also that, Constantinople would also, share credit with that. But we see a huge renaissance. So it's a very self-aware effort to reinvigorate the old Roman ideal only on European Germanic terms. So we have a renaissance centered in Aachen. Unfortunately, Charlemagne's empire does not last. After the Pope puts the crown on his head, which was wonderful for Charlemagne. It gave him what he needed, which was legitimacy in the eyes of the church. And it gave the Pope what he needed, which was the political protection, for his and legitimacy going back to the Pope. So it was a mutually beneficial thing. And we see here at this moment in time the restoration of the Roman Empire. So it's not the case that the Roman Empire comes to a crashing halt. As late as Charlemagne's coronation, we can see a very self-conscious, effort to rethink ancient Rome. Although we are now at the beginning of European history. Okay? Thank you very much.